Hi, I'm Catherine McIntosh, a board member of the Fine Arts Foundation, and I want to welcome you to our new season of programs. We begin with a presentation by CJ Gillick, who is a studio artist and educator who's worked in the ceramic field for over 25 years. Faculty member at Chaffey, Saddleback, and Mount San Antonio colleges, her ceramic career has transformed from wood fire utilitarian wares to mid-range biomorphic sculpture. You can see her work in the exhibition Furious Garden, opening this weekend at the Claremont Museum of Art and continuing through November 27th. Her colorful, detailed ceramic sculptures are beautifully fascinating. So here's CJ to tell us more about her work and her experiences traveling the world.
Hello, and thank you for having me today. I would like to talk today about finding inspiration in nature, locally and abroad. So this is the basis for my artwork. I'm a ceramic artist, and I like to currently make work that's biomorphic in form and sculptural. But that's not the way I started, and it's really my travels along the way through my experience that have pushed me in the directions that I've gone in. So I'd like to start off with talking about where I grew up and what laid the foundation for all this travel. I grew up in Illinois, and although I was born closer to Chicago, most of my childhood and early years were spent out in the country. And this is what the countryside looked like out by me. I would look off at the distance and look at that horizon line and was always wondering what was just out there, just on the other side. And so with that constantly in my thought process, I was always looking for the next adventure, the next way to travel, the next way to go places. So when I was real young, it was riding my bicycle as far as I could to that horizon line. Then it was driving as far as I could. Then it was planes, everything I could do to get traveling, get out, get around, see things, right? So the first step was to go off to college, and I got my undergraduate degree at Southern Illinois University in Carbondale, Illinois. It's the very southern tip of Illinois. And while I was down there, we had a program that was very inclusive, and we had people from all over the world coming to the school to be a part of the ceramics program. And it was really wonderful because I got to meet a lot of people from a lot of different cultures, and I got to experience how they think about clay and how they work with clay. And there was a lot of sharing of ideas. And a good friend of mine who had come out from California had talked to me and shared with me this process called low fire salts. And this is a process that Paul Solner really worked with. And he taught here at Scripps College in Southern California. And so this is the start of my connection to California and this particular area of California. So I learned how to do the low fire salts in Illinois. And I was experiencing this method of working, and I'm hand building and constructing these vessels. And that same friend who taught me this process says, you know, you really got to learn how to wood fire. It's going to be an amazing thing for your work. So I hopped on a plane and I headed west. And one of the most influential things about the trip, other than meeting a wonderful group of people and learning how to wood fire, was this aerial view of our landscape. It's something that has always stuck with me about how our land is divided up and utilized and formed, and that you can actually see that from the air. So this aerial pattern and design is going to come back into my work quite often as well. So I got to Northern California. This is just outside of Chico. And I participated in my first wood fire in this beautiful kiln that's built into the hillside. And it was a really wonderful time for me. And I really started to explore this new technique, the wood fire process. You're building up ash and glaze on the surface of your piece during the firing. And you can see here in this piece that I'm starting to utilize those transitions, that aerial patterning on the work. And I'm doing that by pressing all types of natural materials into the form. So I'm collecting everything from the interior structures of cactuses to peach pits to seashells off the beach, anything I can find, pine cones. And I'm using that to press the clay and create that wonderful surface. And then the wood fire just beautifully highlights it. So I had fallen so in love with the wood fire that I ended up moving to Northern California and firing that kiln for 10 years. But while I was firing that kiln, I did end up moving to Santa Barbara. So I was actually, burning a path between Santa Barbara and Chico to fire that kiln 3 times a year. But while I was in Santa Barbara, I also had transformative experiences. I had the start of the ocean influencing my work and all of the textures that the ocean can provide with seashells and different kinds of crustaceans. And at the same time, I was also working with a construction company. So I was often thinking about building and containment and framing and cabinetry and all these different ideas of building and construction. And so my work started to take on a much more architectural feel. And I also started using more man-made elements to press into the clay as well. And so here you can see both the organic and the man-made and that framing of the work. Now, as I'm doing this, I still have family back in the Midwest. So I'm still traveling, still taking those planes. And I'm becoming more and more captivated with the Western landscape, flying over the beautiful Rocky Mountains and seeing those deep crevices and valleys that the mountains create. Also, flying over some of the areas where we mine in our country, seeing the strip mines from the air is really dynamic, seeing all those layers of earth and how the geology changes through those layers of the earth and the different materials. So all of this extreme texture, we shall say, starts creeping into my work as well. And so I'm really exaggerating the surface of the work. It's to the point where it creeps out around that architectural frame that I've been putting into the work. And it really becomes a piece with tension, with that man versus nature, and who's going to win. And of course, we know nature always wins. And I'm still wood firing this work. And I'm enjoying the engineering for specific uses and forms. So here you can see an asparagus tray, and I do different forms for different uses. Now at this point, I've decided it would be a good time to go back to grad school. So I took a residency in Mendocino, California, in order to put together a new portfolio to apply to graduate school. And the Mendocino coastline is so incredibly beautiful. And you have all of these caves and tunnels through the land. And the headlands are just incredibly beautiful, as well as the tide pools. So a lot of ocean influences, again, a lot of land influences. And now I've also gone to the Mendocino Botanical Gardens, and I reinstilled my love for plants. When I was in high school, I just loved plants, and I worked with horticulture, and I had forgotten this for quite a while. And I went to the botanical garden, and I was just blown away again by the textures and the surfaces and the colors. And I decided that when I went to graduate school, that I would completely change my work. My pieces had become so sculptural that people were afraid to use them in the way that I intended for them to be used. And so I decided that, it would be time to move on to sculpture. But before I could do that, I had to get into grad school. And so here is some of the work that I made for my portfolio application. You can see the ocean creeping in, kind of the barnacle structures on the forms. Still that hint to the man-made, and still the engineering. On this particular piece, I was thinking, we spend so much time putting flowers in a vase, and we only look at the blooms. So what if we had a vase that actually framed out the stems? Because sometimes the stems can be just as interesting as the flowers themselves. So lots of engineering going on, still looking at those really heavy textures and that idea of man versus nature. So here I have almost a culvert running through the center of the bowl, and you can see it both from the interior and the exterior. So just having fun with that engineering. Now, while I'm waiting to find out if I got into graduate school, I'm working for a company that sends me all around the country. And on a business trip, I end up in Florida, and I decide to, on the last day, I had a few minutes, I'm going to go over to the Fairchild Botanical Gardens. And now I'm in a tropical botanical garden, right? And all of these forms and structures in a tropical botanical garden were just amazing to me. And so I'm looking at all of these items and forms and color and thinking, okay, this is where I'm going next. This is where the work is going to go, completely transfixed, especially with stamens and the structures and how they're put together. So with that in mind, I do get into graduate school, and I end up going to graduate school at Utah State University in Logan, Utah. And a wonderful program. I chose it for a few reasons. Excellent professors, a town that I could really just get lost in my work. It was a beautiful area. I love northern Utah in the mountains. I was going to have seasons again. It was just really going to be a complete change of pace. And the last reason I chose Utah State University is they had an amazing study abroad program, which meant I was going to get to go to multiple countries while studying and see how and experience how cultures work with clay. And so I jumped right in, and first thing I did was transitioned from the vessel forms to sculptural forms. And I tried different clay bodies every week. I started mixing my own glazes to come up with a new glaze palette rather than using wood fire. And here you can see in these two pieces that transition of just letting go of the vessel form and moving into sculptural forms. And so this is the start of my bringing color into my work as well. And there's going to be a lot of experimentation before I take the path that I take currently. Now, part of that exploration is going to Australia, which is my first study abroad while I'm at Utah State University. And here I studied in Lismore, which is on the east coast of Australia, just a bit inland from Byron Bay, which is the most easterly point. And it was just beautiful in that area. And again, it was a tropical area. So now I'm getting to experience, all these wonderful creatures and botanicals. I don't know if you guys have noticed that little frog sitting under the petal of the bird of paradise, but wonderful tree frogs all around the area. All different new structures of plants, torch gingers, new types of succulents, hibiscus. Here on the right, we have a Banksia tree pod, and that's going to come into play again. You're going to see this later in the presentation. And this, this form is much like a pine cone on one of our native trees, but it's a very native tree to Australia and had quite the impact on me. Shell ginger. And here is the work that I started creating in Australia. So at this stage, the work it is sculptural, but it's very literal as well. It reads very true to plants. There's roots, there's stems, there's leaves, very identifiable to the type of plant that I'm referencing, but still trying to figure out how to display them. So the majority of these pieces were wall pieces that were displayed on this formation that looks like coral as it starts to die. And I was really captivated with all of these textures, but at a certain point, I felt like they were conflicting with one another. So then I started to move on and explore the relationship. If I paired two plants together, the relationship between the two and the tension created by one looking interested in the other started to captivate me. And this is a smaller maquette for one of those pieces. Now I was in Australia for 6 months, so I came back to Utah and it was time to get busy in the studio. And I came back, it was summer in Australia and I came back to winter in Utah. So I just had this hard time transitioning. So I locked myself in my studio. And this is the first piece I made as I came back. And this piece, it's hard to tell in the photograph, but it's actually almost 5 feet tall. And it has an armature that allows that bloom that's coming out of the side of the plant to move. You can actually bounce it up and down. So there's the articulation of this form. I'm now breaking out and I'm using all new surfaces. So the surfaces of this form are paint and shoe polish. The red is a 2-part rubber. There's flocking on this form. There's all kinds of things happening that I'm experimenting with on this form. So having a lot of fun and playing that relationship between the two plants again. Now, it wasn't long before I ended up in Korea. So I spent a summer in Korea and China. And while we were in Korea, we were seeing a lot of the traditional that you would expect to see in Korea. Ungi pots, a lot of beautiful potters making wood firework, just beautiful, beautiful tradition in Korea. We also went to a contemporary exhibition and it was really wonderful to see the extent that they went to exhibit their work, that they would build these intense displays to display the work at its best. And I really took that in. You know, so often we just see a piece of pottery on a pedestal and that's that. But to see these beautiful rooms, each one was developed to be an element, so light, earth, air, water. Here is the image of the room for water. So this room was very dark, and that's why the picture is difficult to see. But all of these pieces are displayed on a long table that's filled with water. And what would happen from the way the light was reflecting on the piece is you would see the underneath of the piece in the water. And I liked that play between the lighting and the reflection in the water. And so that's going to come back into play as well. So after Korea, we popped over to China and again, seeing a lot of the traditional, but we also went to see a lot of contemporary work as well. So there's a lot of influence while in China. But it's time to get back to the studio and get some work made so I can graduate from grad school. So I came back and I started slip casting my work. And the body of work I came back to make, I decided to let go of any of the stems and the roots that ground the plant. And I wanted to get the forms to look more animated, to look like if you turned your back, they could maybe scuffle off. So I also brought in this black color tone because I felt like it gave the pieces a foundation without having those roots and stems and that literal planting of the form. It was a way to create a foundation. And also, since I'm using so much texture in the work, it gives the eye a place to rest. So these forms, I have singular forms that are exploring form and surface and color. And then I also have forms that are paired up together, exploring that relationship between objects or individuals. Now, you're going to find that a lot of this work also has a reference to human sexuality. The plants are a little sexy, and they're meant to be that way. Here, this piece is displayed in water. And I did this during my exhibition. I had the room dark, just like they had used that darkness in Korea. And I well lit each piece so that there would be a play with the reflection in the water. And so where the pieces are not quite touching in real life, they do look like they're touching in the reflection in the water. And I really felt that that was a fun play on the elements. Now, I've always said I'd go anywhere I was invited. So I found just after I graduated from Utah State, I was moving to Colorado. And in the process of the move, I get an invitation to go to Poland. Would I come and work in the traditional ceramics factories of Poland for 1 month for a symposium? And of course, I said yes. So off to Poland I go with no investigation, no nothing. And I get there, and there's, I believe, 13 of us working together in this symposium. And we each had a different ceramics factory to work in. I worked in the one in the top left of this photograph. It was the art ceramics factory. And the one below is the pipe factory that creates all the sewer pipe for Poland. So really a great time to work in these factories, because we were only expected to create our own work, and our materials were just delivered right to us. There was as much material as we could ever dream of using. And if you were at the pipe factory, a sewer pipe was delivered to you. I was in an art factory that did a lot of slip casting. You can see all the molds in the upper right-hand portion of this image. And I had a pipe just outside my studio door that would deliver gallons of casting slip anytime I turned the valve on. So just a dream to a ceramic artist to have that much material to you at any given moment. Now here's an example of traditional Polish ceramic wares. They use a lot of pattern and a lot of color, and the way that they're creating this is through stamping. So they have all of these very fine stamps made out of sponges that are much like makeup sponges, and they're laser cut. And then they have what they consider underglazes. They're thinner than our underglazes, and so they're able to be stamped onto the surface of the work. So there's very little brushwork and mostly stamping. Now, while I was there, I was able to, of course, walk around and be influenced by more plants. So here's some pieces that are inspired by these berries that I found in someone's garden. And then work that is also inspired by the techniques that I was learning in Poland. And the whole event finished with a ceramics festival in the town where everyone comes, everyone from the factories to home artists, come and display their work in the town square and sell their goods. They also have parades all weekend long, and here are some images of the living sculpture parade. And this is when people go and get doused in casting slip from head to toe in whatever wonderful costumes they decide to buy from the thrift store. And they come out and they parade around as living sculptures. It's really a beautiful, beautiful parade. So after my month in Poland ends, I head back to Carbondale, Colorado. And once again, here is a link back to Claremont, California. So I'm in an area where Paul Solner, who taught at Scripps College, also had a home just outside of Carbondale, Colorado. He was a huge influence on this particular area, which is in the Aspen Valley. It's a gorgeous area, and Carbondale was just a small little town, but it had a clay center, and I was there to do a year-long residency at the clay center. So just a wonderful experience of working in this town. Going back to my work, I decided to focus in, do some more studies on form and surface, and incorporating more materials as well. So on this piece, I'm not sure if you can recognize this, but these are fake eyelashes that are helping to create the stamens on this work. In addition, I'm still continuing with the carving and the surface exploration in different forms. But the one thing about Carbondale, Colorado was the endless snow. It just lasted for months, and it turns out in the long run, I am not a snow person. So after getting exhausted by how many times I had to clean off the car and shovel the drive and drive in the snow and navigate all that, I decided it was time for a change, of course. So I went back to Australia, where I knew there would be absolutely no snow in Perth, Australia. And I was lucky to live right on the water in this beautiful area between Perth and Fremantle. And I had gone there to work with an artist. Her name was Floral, and she creates these fun little narrative pieces that are figurative and based off of her life and her children's lives. So she wanted to open a community studio that taught children and adult classes. And this is the studio. And it was a real fun space on the inside, very colorful, very playful with her work. And we both created work from the studio space, as well as running the classes. And just a wonderful experience for a full year. And while I was there, I also got to explore Western Australia, which is a beautiful part of Australia. The beaches are incredible. The water is so clean and clear. You can see right to the bottom of the tide pools, whether the tide is in or out. And of course, some wonderful little creatures all through Australia. And some wonderful plants as well. So here's some of the work that I created while I was in Australia, really defining more of my color palette. It's going much more what I like to call atomic. So a lot of atomic greens and bright oranges, and playing around with surfaces as always. Here I'm integrating wool, fishing line, and flocking to create the stamens. This piece here, the orange area is flocked, so it's soft and fuzzy. Playing around with the texture and my paint surfaces. But inspiration comes from the most unlikely places. So this was probably one of my greatest inspirations on this particular trip. And if you don't recognize these, which many people won't, they are orthopedic surgery tools from before power tools. And Fleur's, I think it was father-in-law, was an orthopedic surgeon, and she had his collection of tools. And I found these fascinating. And I was utilizing these tools to create new surfaces. And here you can see the surfaces on these vessel forms. So once leaving Australia, I needed to come back to the United States. My year was up. And I needed to decide where to come back to. And I had an offer to go to Portland or to come to Pomona, California. And I chose Pomona, California. So I went from living in the beach in Perth, Australia, to living in downtown Pomona. And I came here so that I could work at the American Museum of Ceramic Art, which I'm sure many of you are familiar with. And if you're not already familiar with it, you should check it out. Lots of good stuff happening over there. But in addition to coming for a MOCA, there's such a rich history of ceramics in Southern California that I really wanted to come and be a part of all that as well. And so here is an image of a friend of mine with a viola fry piece. And there's so much landscape and plants to be inspired by in Southern California. And I hadn't spent any true time in a desert yet. So really in my time here, I'm really learning about desert plants and cactuses and succulents and new plants that I have not experienced before. So I'm having a lot of fun with that. Again, always looking at the structures of plants. And in the studio, while I was here, you know, before I left Australia, I had applied to speak at their national conference for ceramics. And so believe it or not, I've only just landed in Pomona, but I need to fund going back to Australia again. And so I developed a Kickstarter, and in order to do a Kickstarter, you have to have rewards. So that is the impetus for starting my ceramic jewelry line. So different types of pendants, earrings, rings, brooches, mostly in black and white, but a few in color. And continuing refining the vessel forms. So these are what I consider a sipping cup for maybe a fine liqueur or some wine, and my sake cups, and started doing bowls as well. So I have the whole line of vessels, and continuing with the biomorphic sculpture to create that funding to go back to Australia and speak, which worked out really well. And when I got back from that, I was invited by the Maloof Foundation to make a piece for the Maloof sculpture show that happens in the Maloof Gardens. And so this was the piece that I created specifically for this spot in the gardens. And at this point, people have pinholed me as only making small sculpture. And so I wanted to point out the fact that I am more than one gig. So here are my larger pieces for the garden. And let's talk about some of what they're inspired by. So this is the chestnut off of a Cape chestnut tree. It's not what we normally think of when we think of chestnuts, but I found it to be incredibly beautiful. Early in the spring, it's bright chartreuse green. And as it ages over the summer, it becomes more and more yellow. And then it cracks open in different segments and sections. So that is the inspiration for one of the forms. And here's a detail of the second piece of this pair. And it's actually a culmination of probably 5 different plants. And so here's a few of the forms that inspired the second sculpture. So you can see that reference of color and shape. After making Instinct, which was the piece for the garden, I then made Perspective. And this one, I really wanted to work more with that relationship between the 2 forms. So this one was designed for one to stand over and in a way dominate the other form or protect the other form, depending on which way it's set up. And I really like being able to play with that relationship. You can see that just by placement, it completely changes the context of the form. And still always engaging with my intricate surfaces. So here on the right, you can see that reference to that Banksia pod from the beginning of our talk. So that little form of that pine cone-like pod from the Banksia tree. And on mine, it's flocked. So there's little white fuzzy areas between all of the orange nodules on this form. So just getting lost in that detail. Now I still travel around and I teach workshops around the world. And most recently I was able to go to Bali again and teach a workshop there. So Bali is a wonderful place of inspiration for me. It has all of my highlights, right? So it has amazing botanicals, amazing fruits and vegetables, that structural landscape with the rice terraces, the mountains, the volcanoes, the ocean. The entire place is a wonderful inspiration. And then to see how the local culture embraces all of those elements in their traditions is just beautiful to see. So here we're looking at the entryway to a temple during a festival that they were having. And the steps are lined with the blooms of marigolds. And they love using marigolds throughout a lot of their settings and altars and festivals. They also have an incredible tradition of sculpture. So you'll find a lot of stone sculpture through Bali. Here's some sculpture adorned by those marigolds I was just speaking of. And a collection of those beautiful plants. In addition to, here is a bamboo structure. In Bali, they're doing a lot of contemporary architecture with bamboo. And it's quite beautiful. It has a very organic feel about it in an incredibly organic environment. Now the studio in Bali, Gaia Ceramic Studio, is wonderful too. It's an open air studio. So there is a main roof, but the sides of the studio are pretty open and you can hear the rustling of the banana leaves all day long and the chickens that are just on the other side of the studio wall. It's a wonderful experience working here. And I had a good group of people. Carol Guthrow and I taught this workshop together. And we were able to dive into a lot of different processes and surfaces. And here's a couple pieces from that workshop that's some finished, some in progress. Now, recently, through the pandemic, I wanted to build a studio at home for quite a while. And I finally had that opportunity since I needed to teach for my colleges online. So I built this studio real quick. I didn't do it myself. I had somebody do it because I was so busy, but great little studio space. I'm also having time to plant plants in my own yard and watch all the wonderful insects that are coming to the area. So all different types of butterflies and bees and praying mantises. I'm in love with the praying mantises right now. They're fantastic. Can you see them in there, right in the middle? So now this idea of insects and creatures is really pulling into my artwork, and I'm using that as a way to add even more animation to the forms. And I'm excited to see where this goes. This is the first pieces or maquettes for a new series that I'm about to start. And these hang on the wall on these little black clouds. And again, I'm going to try and have a relationship between these forms so that they are showing interest with one another. And that is my inspiration, my travels, and where all of my fantastical ideas come from for these little creatures and plants that I create. So thank you for allowing me to speak today. It was fun to come and share my inspirations and my travels. Thank you very much. Bye-bye.